Thank you, Chakravarti Garu. It is truly a privilege to be a part of this CII seminar on green and sustainable manufacturing. Chakravarti Garu was ideating on this very important meeting, and I had the opportunity to share some thoughts. And it was his suggestion that we put a kind of a context about how do you make green and sustainable chemistry a very simple and adaptable approach. How do you demystify the entire aspects and science? I think today's inaugural session, we have had the opportunity to listen to all the esteemed stalwarts on the dais. It was one of the extremely inspiring sessions I've ever attended. And I think there is a lot of future for us going forward on this. So let me start with this, thinking green. Green is not just a color, it's more like a commitment to sustainability, and green and sustainable manufacturing refers to designing, producing, delivering products that basically minimize the environmental impact and conserve the resources and still be economically viable. 10 years ago, as was mentioned by Chakravarti Garu and Rajmanu Garu, it was not possible to really conceptualize how do you really go into the path of green and sustainable chemistry, because a lot of things were not known. But science has evolved in the last 10 years, in the decade, where we have seen some profound improvements in the way circular processes and recycling have been adopted in other industries, including petrochemical industry, carbon capture, sequestration, use of green solvents. How does one use the green carbon, which is actually coming from a renewable source, have valorization of biorefineries, and most importantly, tie it up to the ethics and economic sustainability. I think a lot of these things have improved. So time has come for us to be able to see how do we evolve and adapt it to the pharmaceutical industry. I'm a chemist, so I'll have to start with a periodic table. And as you can see, a lot of elements there. But there's one element perhaps which is the most important, which is not part of the periodic table, is called SU for sustainability. That's an element that we all would like to follow. Interestingly, we have heard about endangered animals, but I can tell you today that a lot of metals which are there in the periodic table are also called endangered metals, because there is only a finite quantity and some of them are really being consumed at a rate which may not be leaving anything for tomorrow's future. This is something that many of us have studied, and it has been taught in the industry and academia. There are 12 principles of green chemistry. The papyrus is a bit symbolic here. Looks very old, but it's equally fragile. We'll have to use this 12 principles of green chemistry, which was given by a very eminent scientist, Paul Enestas. And what is probably not known is there are also 12 principles of green engineering, which actually kind of show the entire pathway about how does one look at more green and sustainable process, like starting from prevention, atom economy, using safer substances, trying to look at avoiding unwanted protection, deprotection chemistries, and at the same time following safer chemistry, and similarly on the green engineering. While we have not per se focused on green chemistry or green engineering, it is something that the Indian industry and even at the global perspective has actually been doing it. What is very important is to have an economically viable process, environmentally responsible, and eventually an efficient process. We essentially work on certain chemistry criteria where we look into a linear synthesis versus a convergent synthesis. A convergent synthesis has been clearly shown to have a better efficiency in terms of the material consumption, and then using wherever possible a catalytic step rather than a stoichiometric reagent, which will also reduce the amount of reagents that we are using. Try to look at the reduction of steps, which, as Mr. Deepak Sapra mentioned, a synthesis that can be done in 3 steps versus 12 steps, there is going to be a profound impact on consumption of materials, uses, solvents, water, workup, whatnot. All the reactions have to be scalable. So looking at this simplified chemistry criteria, more or less we have been trying to look at the essence of green chemistry principles and at the same time in the engineering. But what is more important is as we look into a very ambitious targets, these metrics are needed to convert the sustainability intent into a more actionable, well-thought design. This is something that is one of my slides. I keep repeating it in many of my talks, but gone are the days where big is always better. The focus from big is better, so we are great, is slowly changing into small, modular, compact systems where per square inch, you're able to produce a more effect, or for a certain volume, you're able to produce the product much more effectively. So there is a lot of kind of general understanding that if you make smaller reactor systems, smaller footprint, it is going to be a very effective way to eventually look at the processes from a sustainability angle. I will come to this a little while from now. So we are a very dominant pharmaceutical industry. We are one of the global suppliers. But if I look at tomorrow's drugs, tomorrow's generics, so looking at a kind of a data, as you can see here, this covers essentially close to 10 years of the approvals, small molecule approvals by FDA. Close to 27% contain fluorines, one or more than one fluorine. And then close to 44% contain chiral centers, more than one or two chiral centers. Now look at, and then there are a cluster of compounds which contain fluorines and chiral centers. Essentially, the complexity of the products that we want to manufacture today, tomorrow, and even in the next 15 years will have a very strong complexity gradient. And now when we are trying to improve and make processes greener and sustainable on one side, other side, the target is shifting, right? You're looking at a much more complex spectrum. So trying to achieve green, sustainable ways to manufacture complex products is a mantra that we have to make sure that we follow for the future. This is something that has also been covered by many of the global groups, a beautiful review in a journal called Organic Chemistry, Journal of Organic Chemistry. The molecular complexity is a driver for chemical process innovation. And I think Hyderabad has, and Telangana in particular, and if you expand it to India, has a huge chemistry pool. There's a lot of chemistry talent. Our ability to engineer, design processes, looking at any stiff, complex target makes it a very competitive opportunity for us. And I think that if we can do it in a sustainable manner, there is nothing like it. So we should not look at this molecular complexity as more as a deterrent, but more as an opportunity to showcase ourselves and be ahead of other countries as well. Now, coming back to the metrics, I think this is a very important. Now, there have been two kinds of metrics. One metric is used based on the materials. It's a mass-based criteria where we look into the material consumption. The other kind of metrics are more on the impact. We are looking at hazard, we are looking at toxicity, the environmental impact, we are looking into the life cycle analysis. It's more of an impact-based metrics. So if you see the key process metrics, percentage yield is something that we have always been looking into, but there's something called atom economy, where we look into what is the amount of number of the overall molecular weight of the product divided by the molecular weight of all the reagents that you have used, the starting metals that you have used. This was something that was coined by Professor Barry Trost from Stanford. I had an opportunity to meet him a few years before COVID. And then people have again come up with something called E factor, which talks about the waste that is being generated, again by a British chemist called Roger Sheldon, which talks about waste. So ideally, if you can generate zero waste, it's an ideal process, but the waste leads to all the solvents, reagents that go into producing a 1 kilo of the product. Then there are other aspects like solvent intensity, process mass intensity, reaction mass efficiency. I would like to, there are multiple concepts, right? Most of us who wear a kind of a digital watch to tell us the health metrics, what is the heartbeat, what is the number of steps, what is the saturation levels. So please look at these metrics as a way to tell whether the process is healthy. And they do shed a lot of information, but I wanted to draw your attention to the process mass intensity, which has been termed by the global pharmaceutical multinationals under the ACS Green Chemistry Roundtable as a very suitable metric to describe the performance or even the sustainability, the efficiency of the entire process. So this is something that has come up. I'll go into some more details. But what is also important is the qualitative aspects, looking into the hazard categorization, the solvent greenness category, whether there are chlorinated solvents which cannot be environmentally acceptable when they will have to. Even the recycling could be a bit tricky. And there is also the concept of the three carbons, the green carbon, the blue carbon, and the green carbon. The black carbon comes from the petrochemical. Ideally, we should move away from the black carbon and move into more renewable sources like green. So these are the quantitative, qualitative aspects which give a very good indication about the efficiency of a process. And then during the later part of the proceedings, we'll be talking, I think, a debate on the carbon intensity and also the energy aspects of how industry uses as a part of producing these pharmaceuticals and intermediates. What I wanted to also mention is we should see metrics as design signals and not just reports, because we'll have to have metrics which are easily interpretable, and we can nail down some of the causative factors that are essentially making sure that we are not really moving in the right direction. So I think there is a movement from a decision stage. We look at the metrics and the metric signal, and then have an actionable plan as a part of the decision outcome to be able to make the right transformation. When I was looking into this, I saw that the UNEP, which is the environmental program from the United Nations, has also done a kind of a discussion on the 2030 goals, where more than 100 stakeholders from various chemical industry, including pharma and other chemical industries within the Europe and elsewhere, they were consulted and to set up the goals. But then they also wanted, okay, how do we reach a path to these goals? So these were the 10 kind of potential objectives that were mentioned. And if you see here, the chemical hazard, minimize the chemical hazard, looking into regrettable substitutions, avoiding them, looking into sustainable sourcing, and also the production processes. So these were the essential objectives that were given, and each one of them can have a very clear path as to how we can achieve it. What is important, I think it was already mentioned in the inaugural session, and sustainability essentially starts with the design thinking. How do we make a design to an impact? And how do we essentially choose the processes where we can eventually visualize the impact in a very accurate manner? So the point I wanted to highlight is we can't re-engineer the sustainability. We cannot, it's not a kind of a course correction that happens during the course of our activities, because it's a cascade of design choices. And as you can see from a domino effect, if it is not done right from a design perspective, this will have a cascading impact, and there are points at which we cannot do a kind of a course correction anymore. What is interesting is this is something that kind of echoed by all the major regulatory agencies like FDA and EMA, and these are some statements that I've taken to see that regulatory agencies are really positive about kind of encouraging the industry to make a transition into green and sustainable manufacturing. But we will come to, okay, what exactly defines the elements of green and sustainable manufacturing in a language that is easy to comprehend. But if you see FDA and EMA, they are increasingly focused on life cycle thinking and material efficiency. They've also mentioned that the ICH-Q11 guidelines, which talk about the processes and batch manufacturing, both for chemical as well as biological-based therapeutics, there is a lot of kind of emphasis on aligning with certain guidelines, which will render the processes as more green and sustainable. One of the things which is very interesting, I want to read it out for you, is the design of the manufacturing process should include the appropriate selection of raw materials, reagents, solvents, and then there should be sufficient controls to make sure that the quality is always consistent of the target level with minimal environmental impact. I think the last bit is both something that we need to control, but also is contingent upon how we choose the reagents that go into a given process. So it's a kind of a loop back effect that happens here. But this is something that we have. And during my discussion with Chakravarti Garu before this seminar, he said he has actually witnessed during the conversations with many in many of the forums that the global buyers expect reagent transparency, supply chain traceability, and process robustness. There's a lot of emphasis on eventually, putting a process as a qualified green and sustainable way of manufacturing that. If you look into the advanced pharmaceutical manufacturing in a simple formula, easy to understand, it's nothing but good chemistry, good process engineering, plus QBD and quality by control. There are different elements of all this which are illustrated in the slide, starting from benign solvents and others. But what is important here is this advanced pharmaceutical manufacturing has two aspects. For existing pharma, where we are already producing intermediates, APIs, there is a need to review the current processes and see how does one green them or improve them to kind of rise up the ladder. It's an incremental innovation. Very carefully, strategically make those changes which can convert the existing processes into hazard-free, more safe, bringing in the right substitutions and looking at it. But then there's, on the other side, there is also this new products, essentially when the CDMOs are leading much of it, there is a need to get the DNA right, DNA to RNA to protein. So if you get the right DNA in the right template, the future processes may not require too much of interventions to revisit them from a sustainability perspective. I think there is a clear opportunity, both pharma and also the subsector of CDMO, to operate. And looking at all these things, it's all about boiling down to the right chemistry template, route of synthesis, putting the right process engineering, QBD, QBC. Today, in fact, Rajmanu Garu has mentioned about the flow chemistry initiatives that we have been doing, and so with support from Dr. Reddy's, Flores, many other companies, and Pharma Excel has supported a lot of training programs. The good process engineering is something I wanted to just bring it to your attention very briefly. I think gone are the days where we have a few reactors with which we have to live and manufacture. There are a lot of innovative reactor designs. Continuous manufacturing, flow chemical based systems offer a lot of advantage. You can perform really hazardous chemistry faster, safer. We can do a lot of challenging transformations which were otherwise not done by us so far, where we imported from the neighboring country. We can also look at a very consistent product quality and a smaller footprint. Of course, the real estate in India is generally increasing, so the footprint also seems to have an economic aspect in terms of thing. But flow chemistry is now a fairly mature way of doing a lot of reactions. Many times we import materials, starting materials, because we cannot translate those chemistries in our premises because of a hazard factor. But it is possible to do certain reactions which are otherwise not difficult to manage, but on a smaller footprint. You can fluorinations, or for that matter, halogenations, nitrations. These are things that have always kept us a little bit on the defensive, and we can actually do it in a very effective manner and at a smaller footprints, because the risk of something going wrong is minimal, and with the right controls, this can be achieved. While today I'm not really going into the details of flow chemistry, but it is not a standalone element. Flow chemistry, continuous manufacturing, essentially brings improved heat transfer. We can handle hazardous reagents. We can reproducibly use, because there is a less human component. It's less a human variability about additions, dosing, mixing, right? These are more automated, and that makes it much more consistent. And if we know, we can achieve reactions even in a thin window of conditions by reproducing it consistently. But what is equally important is there are other elements which need to support eventually in harnessing the entire potential. That is in terms of looking at sensors, process analytical technology, which is needed both to make sure that our process health is going well, but bring in the quality by QBC, the control-based approaches, and looking into also many other parameters, because usually in the lab we have the reactions from breakfast to lunch, lunch to dinner, dinner to the next day breakfast. But what actually happens every second, every minute is something that we tend to miss. There's a lot of data that is getting accumulated during the course of these reactions. The tools will also help us to log a lot of data, which can retrospectively tell us what might have gone wrong and bring in those process robustness. At the same time, it doesn't mean that everything has to happen in flow. I think hybrid is the right word. There is a clear need to also modernize the current batch reactor systems. We can bring in the precision dosing, we can look at different PAT tools, we can look at automated feeds, and a lot of data can be generated with our existing batch systems, so that we kind of improve the overall efficiency and including the throughput. All this is now not difficult to imagine, because we have a lot of this AI, machine learning, digital tools that are already available, which can be integrated easily. One simple thing is, even with a smart batch reactor, be it on the fermentation, the concept of digital twins to actually understand the entire process and then look into the reproducibility or any variation or out of specification that's happening in certain batches is being understood well in order to control it more effectively. So looking at, I think there are 4 elements. There could be more, but largely fitting these 4 pillars: flow chemistry, process analytical technology, smarter batch, and using the right digital tools. Almost everything is available now, and this is also kind of getting churned out at a very fast pace. If we can integrate these elements, I think it's going to be not only advanced pharmaceutical manufacturing, we can add the suffix of sustainable to it. This is how some of the reactor systems are looking at, both in the lab and at the manufacturing. and these can produce tons in an easy capacity, and you can tune the throughput whether you want tons a day or half a ton a day, or you want to even improve it. I think we have had people here in this audience who have seen some similar systems in China, where you have a multi-storied based production facilities. But what is important is integration of all of this. Essentially here we are looking at it in creating a sustainability impact. And this can be measured in simple terms. We look at reduced solvent usage. We're looking at reduced energy demand per kilo or per ton of what we want to produce. Eventually looking into the lower waste, which also means that lower recycling and reducing the E factor. And at the same time, this also brings in an on-demand production capability, which is equally important. A lot of the Western countries are looking at kind of onshoring their capabilities. And when they look at onshoring some of the capabilities to make APIs within their own premises post-COVID, this is something that has happened. They did not want to go back to the batch processes. They wanted to adapt the most, within quotes, a perfect, smart way of manufacturing it. So I think it's something that is also equally important as we look at the entire transition. Now comes some specifics. Again, I'm just kind of trying to put the path of how does one look into green and sustainable manufacturing and look into a language that we can easily talk and make it happen. Selection of materials eventually up to the LCA, life cycle assessment. Reagent selection is extremely important. Solvent selection is extremely important. So there have been some guidelines. If we look into the ACS Green Chemistry Roundtable and the Institute, in this Venn diagram, you can see reagents that are typically used for a given reaction. You can look at reagents which can offer a high degree of scalability, but then there are reagents which are also very green. But unfortunately, every green reagent may not be scalable, may not be employable in a wide utility. We'll have to make a judicious choice. I think that's where our intelligence comes in choosing the right reagent in this particular framework to be able to do a particular transformation. Without naming a specific example, a low-cost reagent might offer a reduction reaction or an oxidation reaction, but the real encumbrance of the problem comes more in doing the workup and disposing the material. The reaction looks good, but the work that happens post the reaction is something that none of us show. Both academics and sometimes even in industry, we don't really talk about it. But I think it's a more comprehensive way of looking at it, and it's a core value where we look at a sustainable reagent and a transformation. There is also a guideline that a reagent should work ideally under ambient conditions, ambient temperature. So if you are kind of using the cryo or if you're going to higher temperatures, there is an energy component which unfortunately reflects again. Last but not the least, yields are extremely important. Even if you have a green reagent and a low yield, the effective outcome is no longer green. This is where during a discussion that we have had with few companies and academics, we wanted to understand what are the basic ingredients, building blocks in a chemical process. So we have decided as three things: reagent, solvent, and metal. So if you can actually know which reagent we are using, how does it get consumed, and what happens to the reagent post-reaction, and then what are the solvents and what are the metals, because metals cannot be incinerated. Some of the metals will still remain. And all of them will contribute to a unique kind of waste, and how do we treat it? So at this point of time, I think we were looking at material utilization as an important element, as a prequel to waste management. How does we make it effective? And at the same time, if there are certain reagents and solvents or conditions that cannot be handled in a batch process due to a risk factor, if it can be done in flow, it still offers you to choose the best chemistry. As I always say, you have a flask in one hand and you have a tube in the other hand. Both are your own gadgets. You want to choose which one to use and go about it. So the reagents and solvents and metals, RSM, I think plays a very simplified thinking. And if you can work on a greener, more comfortable, more acceptable criteria. Now there are publications that are in the public domain. What is a green solvent? How you can substitute an existing chlorinated solvent with a more greener equivalent. All these guidelines are there. And it's easy to make a kind of a switch and re-experiment and redevelop the process. This all eventually comes down to the concept of waste management practices. And if you see the hierarchy of waste management: disposal, treatment, recycling, source reduction, elimination is actually the most ideal concept. If you can completely remove the concept of waste, I think that's a philosophy. Even if you cannot achieve, it should be our first priority about how do we eliminate waste? How do we recycle? How do we kind of dispose? I think it should be something that is probably not something that should dominate 2026 to maybe Viksit Bharat. We have to look at newer ways, and if something doesn't exist, challenge the next generation scientists in creating a reagent which might fit the expectations. So there is a lot of innovation stimulus that can happen driven by industry. At this point, actually, just before COVID started, we had the opportunity to host a meeting of few academics who are the who's who in the global context. They call themselves as chemists for sustainability. You can see Professor Govardhan Mehta, who was earlier the Vice Chancellor of University and also the Director of IISc Bangalore. He is one of the globally well-recognized organic chemists. Then we have Professor Stephen Matlin from Imperial, Professor Ellen Krief from Belgium. So they essentially have written some really thought-provoking and thought leadership in articles about the concept of sustainability. The fact is, as we stand today, as Anand Garu mentioned this morning, the climatic change is because we have already breached many planetary boundaries. We are going into a state of irreversibility. I think now if we do sustainable chemistry, we might sustain the momentum. I think looking into the reversibility is something that may not happen in the near future. So there is one statement I wanted to read it out for you, which kind of takes this hierarchy of waste management practice. I think very, very thought-provoking. Waste does not exist. There is only post-trash. We need to stop thinking of any materials as being waste, and the very concept of waste matter should disappear. It's a kind of an inspiring statement. It will essentially if you look at every reagent, solvent, metal, it kind of helps us to do. All this essentially builds into this complicated looking dashboards called LCA methodology dashboards, which are now available. This is particularly something that I've worked with a very bright scientist who is now the director of CSR NIRI, Dr. Venkat Mohan, when we were looking into building a concept called Material Circularity Index, where we look into circularity of every reagent and then bring it into this LCA. So this is something that he has developed, which is, and now he has evolved it, which is which can be implemented by the Indian industry to look into the entire LCA methodology. The whole point here is we are going from the scope of the definition, looking into the inventory, the process, the waste stream, and at the same time whether we can rebuild it. I think there are many other tools which are commercially available, but it is time to implement. Again, as I said, this is more like an Apple Watch that one might wear to know whether we are healthy enough. And you don't get nervous by the readings, but try to use the readings to your advantage and take the corrective steps. I think that's the whole purpose of not to scare us away, but as I see, I think a lot of good progress has happened. There's no denying. A lot of transition into biomanufacturing, BioE3, which is a flagship DBT initiative, where we're trying to manufacture using a cell and not a flask. I mean, this is truly a thing, but integration of the right biocatalysis, flow chemistry, and many other technologies is really going to make a big difference. And what is interesting about continuous manufacturing is, except for vitamin D3 synthesis and few other limited products which I can count on my fingertips, we don't use light for doing reactions. That is because it is not possible to irradiate with the same efficiency, intensity, large volume reactors. But in a flow-based setup, you can use light as a reagent. We are able to use now electrochemistry as a reagent. I'm happy to share that in India, 500 kilometers away, electrochemical processes for production at a large volume is already happening. So we're using current as a reagent. We are looking into biocatalysis in flow. We are looking into mechanochemistry, which might ideally say that we don't need a solvent to do a transformation. So the science is emerging at a very big pace. But what I want to really say is the industry is the pull factor. The more the industry absorbs, the more innovation will become more meaningful. And I think the initiative voluntarily to experiment with some of this newer science is something that I think would be an important aspect as one of the elements of this symposium, seminar. Towards the end, I think the concept of carbon neutral, very important. We have discussion, I think, on SBTi targets and carbon emissions and all. But the thinking is now looking at moving beyond the carbon neutral strategy, looking into a circular economy based approach where carbon neutral is one step to know whether we have reached it, but we'll have to move beyond it to be energy efficient and to bring in all the elements. This is something, of course, I've borrowed it from a European Union 2050 target where they're looking at their own goals. But a similar kind of goals can be crafted. Again, we have all the leadership here. Maybe Chakravarti Garu could also support in taking this leadership and creating our own equivalent of a round table right here in Hyderabad, maybe with CII, PharmExcel. We have all the leaders. Rameshwara Garu is there. And create our own set of easily adaptable, take the learnings forward and go and move from a carbon neutral to a circular economy. So with that, today I wanted to kind of say that the language of sustainability is very easy. It's not complex. You just need to look at what are the letters in the alphabet and how do you make your own words, and then we can do write the poetry. But a word of caution. Chemistry is a double-edged sword. There is a risk. The chemistry can also lead to danger, pollution. It can also be the source. So with that, I wanted to put a kind of a thing that it's a core science that can either nurture or it can disrupt sustainability. It's a question of how do we wield it and use engineering, use leadership, inspiration, and commitment and intent. I think this is what I wanted to kind of share. Hopefully, 2 years from today, we will be talking some absolute specifics about moving from carbon neutral to sustainability. Again, I thank Chakravarti Garu, CII for this opportunity. Wanted to share. I think this is something that everybody knows, but putting it in a kind of a format which tries to make it a simple, easy to grasp kind of scenario. Again, thank you so much.